for joining us on the KGW live stream. Right now we are chatting with a registered dietitian. This is Danielle Toepfer.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining us and coming on and being put on the spot and answering all these nutrition, health-related questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And I know we talked a little bit about it, but not a lot. And for some of you, you may not know, or if you haven't tuned in earlier this week, but this is all part of our Journey to Wellness series. We've been doing it all week. This kind of caps it off. And what it stemmed from was my diagnosis earlier this year that I'm pre-diabetic, which was a shocker. I didn't see it coming. But once I learned that the CDC said 1 in 3 Americans are pre-diabetic and 90% of them don't even know it, I thought, okay, something needs to be done. Someone needs to bring this topic up because there's so much that can be done to prevent diabetes. I mean, once you're pre-diabetic, you're kind of on track or on the road to diabetes. So I guess my first question, I mean, hearing that stat, do you see this kind of thing in your day-to-day work? I mean, is that very believable?
Oh yes, it's very believable. And my job, I work at a hospital. I work in the burn center, so we get burn patients, but they come in with, you know, other diseases or illnesses often unknown. So we often will see patients that have undiagnosed diabetes and they did not know that they were living with it. So I would definitely believe that statistic.
Yeah, and you've been a registered dietitian for 10 years now. Do you think you've seen more cases of diabetes or more cases of pre-diabetes pop up since you've become a registered dietitian?
I would say it's been pretty common throughout my career. And I don't know if it's just because of I've always worked in, you know, acute care and critical care. We get sick people, so I see, you know, sicker people on a regular basis. So I don't know if that's why I see it all the time. So I can't really say I've seen more or less, but I definitely would not say less.
So I know becoming a registered dietitian involves a lot of schooling, a lot of that legwork to become a registered dietitian. What would you say in the American diet is mostly to blame for prediabetes and diabetes? I mean, I know sugar isn't good for you. Is it just the amount that we're consuming?
I think there's a lot of factors that play into that. I think a lot, you know, one of the biggest things is the food we eat today, highly processed foods, contributed prepackaged foods, our lifestyles, you know, and, you know, maybe we're not as active as we should be, but it's also very individual. You know, I have heard people who do try to eat a healthy diet and are active, and they can still get diabetes, and maybe that factor is genetic. But I would say for the large amount of Americans, it's definitely our diets. There's a lot of fad diets. There's you know, a lot of misinformation out there that's put out to consumers. You know, even from the food industry. You know, the packaging that you see telling you that this is good for you, eat this, it will help you achieve this, and that's not necessarily true. So.
Okay, and I know we're also fielding questions from our Facebook page, so if you have any questions at all, please post them, go to our Facebook page because we want to get them answered. One question that I know has popped up a few different times from several different people is about the keto diet, and that is something that I think a lot of people are really interested in right now. A lot of people are doing or experimenting with. What's your take on it?
Yeah, so that's actually a question that I get all the time from friends, family, co-workers, you know, and what I always tell them is fad diets have been around since the early 1900s, and, you know, the keto diet for the everyday person I would definitely consider a fad diet. Any diet that takes out a whole food group, that should be a red flag to you. It's not something that's necessarily going to be sustainable long term. You, of course, are going to lose weight with that because you're cutting out a lot of things that you would normally eat. You know, if we were having this conversation maybe 20, 30 years ago, we might be talking about, you know, a low-fat diet or, you know, maybe an Atkins diet or maybe a South Beach diet, but, you know, or a cabbage soup diet. So, you know, throughout time, you know, and all those diets will help you lose weight. weight, because like I said, you're cutting out, a food group. But it's hard to sustain that and live your life and be happy. Nowadays we don't eat just food just to, live and survive. It is something that we do take pleasure in. It's enjoyable. I myself love going out to eat and enjoying what we have here in the Pacific Northwest. But, as far as the keto diet goes, I think that the evidence behind it is for people who have epilepsy. So it's a very high fat diet, maybe moderate to low in protein and very low in carbohydrates. And those patients actually have certain markers in their blood that are monitored to make sure that it's not, they're not overdoing it, which I think what people are following now when they follow a keto diet is just a very high protein diet, which, for some people, you don't need all that protein, unless you're hitting the gym 5 days a week for an hour or two, getting swole, or you're an endurance athlete. You don't necessarily need that much protein. And also, like, cutting out whole grains and fruits and vegetables, you're missing out on so many vitamins, minerals, nutrients that are really important for overall health. So, and also we just don't know a whole lot about the keto diet, in everyday people. So I like to bring it back to basics, which people don't like to hear about. Eating a variety of foods, portion control is very important. Trying to eat, foods that are wholesome and things that you're making yourself, trying to avoid convenience foods. I think that's really important in a diet.
Okay, and as far as the keto diet goes, and the only reason I'm kind of wondering a little bit more about it is because so many people are on it. Are there any health drawbacks? I mean, like, if you were to do it for a short time, just to lose the weight, is there anything bad about doing something like that?
There could be, if you're saying you're going to do it for months at a time to lose weight, having that amount of, animal products, that amount of meat, that could be bad. You need a lot of high fiber, high antioxidant foods that come from fruits, vegetables, legumes to help keep your GI health healthy, cardiac health, and like you said, you didn't know you were pre-diabetic. Some people might not know that they have heart disease, which, putting a lot of, foods that might be too much for us might not be a good thing.
You're talking about like high fat foods?
Yeah, and not necessarily high fat foods, but, eating a lot of, there are studies that show that if you are eating too many animal products, you could put yourself at risk for, colon cancer. And I don't necessarily know what length of time you need to eat those foods. It's probably a longer period of time, but I guess if your goal is to lose weight and you're doing it for a short period of time, when you stop the diet, you're going to gain weight. So, that's probably, that's not going to go along with your goals.
Yeah, and that's kind of behind the whole yo-yo dieting thing.
Right, exactly.
Which, people go on fad diets and then they get off because they've accomplished their weight loss goals and it all comes back and they're back on a diet.
Right, exactly.
Okay. And Andrew, he is behind the scenes monitoring our social media, the questions that we're getting. So you have one, right?
I have a question. Alexandra is wondering, as far as a short-term goal, would eliminating and avoiding prepackaged food be a good place to start?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a great place to start. Limiting the types of beverages you're drinking, high sugary beverages like sodas, juices, things like that, alcohol, those really add up, and you don't really feel full sometimes from those things, or feel satiated and satisfied, I guess, is what I was trying to say.
And you talked a little bit about those high sugar drinks, like the sodas, and even like your pumpkin spice lattes or whatever, all those pumps of syrup that that go into it. Is there a good way to kind of wean yourself off? I mean, is there a sugar withdrawal? Because I know people can get grumpy sometimes.
They can, and I don't know how much of that is biological or just, the personality. But yeah, I mean, just you could, cut back on the pumps, tell them like, I don't know how many pumps that's not really my drink of choice, but you could say put half the amount of pumps in there and then just kind of wean yourself off. And I do know from my own experiences, and I hope my husband doesn't, get mad for me bringing him up, but he's got a big sweet tooth, and since we've been together and married, the amount of sweets that he probably eats is less, and he definitely craves less of it. So it can happen. That's my own anecdotal experiences. If you do start to slowly cut down incrementally, you just don't crave it as much. So.
Okay.
yes to your question.
Okay, great. And another Facebook question that we got a little bit earlier this week from Linda Davis. She says, I have found several sugar-free products that contain maltodextrin, which can spike blood sugar even if it's considered not sugar. I find it very frustrating to find things that are labeled sugar-free and make diabetics think that they're okay to eat, but they have ingredients in them that can raise your blood sugar. So if somebody wants to keep those baked goods around, that they have a sweet tooth, are there good sugar substitutes that they can look at? Because, you know, you've heard, I'm sure you've heard all these, you know, things about chemical sweeteners and all that. So.
Yeah, and I mean, from a purely food science standpoint, you know, it really depends on what you're doing to what you're making, because sugar does have certain chemical properties that, you know, will cause a certain browning effect, or not just the taste. And, you know, that goes for other ingredients. People try to replace butter or, you know, different flours with gluten, and they can be done. It takes a lot of experimenting, but a lot of those just have, you know, properties that allow the food to look and have a certain mouthfeel or texture. So I've heard people have had good luck with baking with things like stevia and, you know, whatnot, but it might take a little bit of tweaking. I personally, you know, I don't like to change things. You know, if I'm going to have a cookie, I'll have a cookie, but I'm also able to kind of have some self-control.
Okay, yeah.
I know that's not the case for everybody. You know, that way, you know, because if it just doesn't taste right, then you're going to feel a little deprived, and then you're, you know, so.
That's true. Everything in moderation.
Moderation, yeah.
Moderation is key.
I hate, people hate when dietitians say there's no bad foods, but, you know, I'd rather focus on the foods that we should be eating instead of the foods that we shouldn't be eating. So.
And I know personally, when I started researching all this, I have a sweet tooth as well. I started baking with date paste, actually.
Okay.
So I used dates to sweeten, you know, my cookies or whatever, and it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. So I mean, I guess there are alternatives.
You just have to experiment. You might find something that works really well. And I do like to try different recipes that do use, you know, ingredients that might not normally work, but I usually follow like an actual recipe instead of me, you know, working in the kitchen and changing this. I don't have time for that. I'm going to spend time baking something.
You're
I want
to do
it
it right.
turn out.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I know Andrew, who's monitoring our social feeds, has another question. If you have any, post them on our Facebook, because that's where he's getting them.
And James is wondering, what advice can you offer about monitoring glycemic index and glycemic load?
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting question. That's a pretty general question, and that's not really something we look at too much. I mean, if you're specifically a diabetic, we generally look at the amount of carbohydrates are in the food, and, you know, how many carbs per meal you should have depending on your weight and your age and your gender. So I'm not quite sure how to answer that question, but yeah, and that's the thing about nutrition. Putting out general guidelines and recommendations can be very difficult because people's individual needs are always, you know, always so different, you know, and everybody is so different.
And I know a lot of people do talk about glycemic index, especially if you're diabetic or maybe if you're even pre-diabetic. Is it important to kind of...
It's not something that I've heard about. I think they've done away with kind of looking at glycemic index, and things have changed a little bit. So.
So that's more kind of the old school way of looking at things?
Yeah, that's not really what we, you know, teach when we have new diabetics. It's more about how many carbs per meal you would need, you know, depending on what your individual needs are.
I see. And is that because, you know, carbs, simple carbs, turn into sugar once they hit your body?
And it probably depends too what you're eating with your meal. I mean, if you're going to have, you know, a good amount of fat or protein with that meal, it's going to slow digestion. There's a lot of variability.
Okay, so in terms of what to avoid, I've heard avoid the white stuff, like the white sugar or like, you know, the white bread. And I know that you're trying to stay like positive, saying, hey, everything's inclusive. But if you wanted to maybe scale back a little, what are some good places to start? Where are some good places to start?
And like, I don't like the stay away from white things because, you know, like potatoes, cauliflower, onions, they have so many good, you know, health properties to them. So, you know, that's actually what my father-in-law's doctor told him to do. And then he comes and stays with me, and I was like, no, like, you can have potatoes, you can have cauliflower, it's so good for you. But, you know, like, you know, if people wanted to start scaling back, It's hard to, like I said, give a general, because I don't know what you're eating. I don't know what physical activity you're doing. So it is hard to make a general statement. But like I said earlier, the easiest place to start, what I see is most common, is what are you drinking? Are you drinking things with calories? Are you drinking sodas or juices or sports drinks? Because just cutting back on a few hundred calories a day, you can lose, 10 pounds in a year. There's 3,500 calories in a pound. So, you do the math out there. But yeah, just cutting back on a couple hundred calories a day, which I don't like to enforce counting calories, but if people just want a quick and dirty answer, you can find one thing in your diet that you feel like you're overindulging in and maybe cut back there.
Got it. Okay, back to Andrew, who's got another question from our KGW Facebook page.
And Anita Brown is wondering, for diabetics, is fruit a useful way to supplement those sugars?
Oh yeah, that is interesting.
And fruit is a really healthy source of sugar. It's got fiber. I would definitely encourage that over fruit juices or smoothies. But again, it is a carbohydrate and it will affect your blood sugar. So that is something that you have to be mindful of. So I'm not sure what you would replace with, but you wouldn't want to overdo it because that could cause, too high of blood sugars.
I see. So fruits are great, but also in moderation.
In moderation, yeah.
Are there certain fruits, because I have done a little bit of research about this too, are there certain fruits that are lower in sugar that maybe diabetics might be able to partake in a little bit more of, or at least be more comfortable partaking in?
Yeah, and the grapefruit, it's the time of year that has a little bit less sugar than maybe your very ripe banana, or but again, everybody, or I shouldn't say everybody, people who have diabetes will notice certain foods affect them differently than what their friend who has diabetes. So it's something that they have to keep a close eye on, and when I tell people who are new diabetics, sometimes it definitely helps to keep a food journal and monitor what you're eating and monitor your blood sugars after the meal, so that you can, when you look back, you could say, oh wow, when I ate that really made my blood sugar high, even though it was the same amount of carbs at that meal that it was my, maybe my lunch meal. So keeping track of it helps.
I've heard that berries can often be a good alternative too, to the really ripe banana or something, because they have antioxidants, and strawberries and blueberries are a little bit lower in sugar.
Yeah, just a little. Yes.
Okay, so that's correct.
Yeah.
Perfect. Andrew has another question. Thanks so much, guys, for weighing in on Facebook. We really appreciate this.
And Nikki's wondering, she says eating healthy snacks every 2 to 3 hours is important for keeping your blood sugar stable. What do you recommend as far as the frequency of when you eat and how much you eat?
I say eat when you're hungry. That your body does it does really great at regulating your hunger signals. But eating snacks throughout the day, I think, is really important. And just paying attention and being mindful to your own body cues. I think that's a good way to regulate your weight and when you eat. So yeah, that's a good question.
As far as, I know we've talked a little bit about people with diabetes already, but for those who are not there yet, and I'm sure there are a lot of people that are on the road and don't know it, are there any signs at all? Because for me, before my diagnosis, I was relatively active. I'm a dancer. I don't eat any worse than my friends or coworkers.
Right.
I mean, how do you even know?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, going to your physician for a yearly physical. One of the big signs is weight loss. People lose weight when they have diabetes, just because their bodies aren't able to process the sugar that they're eating. So that sugar is pretty much floating around in your blood being unused because you don't have the insulin or the ability to use that glucose for energy. So you'll often see people lose a lot of weight and then it's just unexplained, and then they go to the doctor and they find out that their blood sugars are very high.
Interesting.
And they might get put on medication or insulin, and then they gain weight again because they're utilizing that glucose.
And that's another thing. I think there's a misconception that people with diabetes or prediabetes are obese or bigger, but that is not the case.
No.
You can be a rail thin person and still get diabetes.
Yes.
So.
Yes.
Okay, Andrew, you've got one last question from our Facebook page.
We've got a question from Jeff Lucas. He says he works out 5 days a week. He's very active, but he needs to reduce inflammation. And he was told he needed to reduce sugar and red meat, but he's worried about keeping up his carb intake while exercising at such a high level.
It sounds like you should see a registered dietitian and sit down with them and get some very specific guidelines. But I mean, reducing inflammation, you want to include, fatty fish in your diet, seeds and nuts. Those are also really good sources of, omega-3 fatty acids and olive oil, things like that. Trying to use those types of fats in your cooking, and including a lot of, like you were talking about, berries, antioxidants, fruits, vegetables. Making sure your diet is very colorful is really going to help with that. But if you have very specific goals and training goals, I would definitely recommend seeing a sports dietitian where they could sit down with you and kind of work through that. So
okay, great. Well, thank you so much for tuning in on our stream. Thanks for the questions, and thank you for answering all the questions. Again, registered dietitian Danielle Toepfer with Legacy. Thanks for joining us.
yeah, thank you.
Okay, see you guys later. Lots of questions.
Awesome. Yeah.